Welcome to another edition of Grace Under Pressure, where my guest today is Julia Fabris McBride. I'll tell you all about Julia in just a moment. Grace Under Pressure is that show that very often deals with what we call the soft stuff, the caring, the commitment, and the courage. And when you exert these forces, grace for the greater good, you do it to bring people together. So welcome, Julia Fabris McBride.
Thank you very much, John. I'm so happy to be on this podcast.
Well, I want to tell everybody about you. You have a wonderful, interesting background. You're the CEO of Kansas Leadership Center, which is in Wichita, Kansas. And you have educated in leadership more than 15,000 people. That's pretty amazing. You're a certified coach and former actor and the author of Teaching Leadership. You split your time between Wichita and Matfield Green, Kansas. And your newest book with the co-author of Ed O'Malley is When Everyone Leads, How the Toughest Challenges Get Seen and Solved. What a remarkable title. Welcome, Julia.
Thank you, John. I'm really happy to be here. And I'm glad that you find that title compelling.
It is compelling indeed. And what else I find, maybe not compelling, but interesting and right up my alley, is you began in theater. So tell us about that and how you drifted into leadership.
Yeah, I came up in the Chicago suburbs doing theater and then went to the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art, spent 3.5 years in London, came back to Chicago, eager to do theater that spoke to kind of the social and political issues of Chicago in the 1980s and 1990s. I did that work, but after a while, I found that I wanted a life that allowed me to have a garden and eventually a child and a husband and family. And as I was transitioning, and this was in my early 40s, from really thinking of myself as an actor, I discovered coaching. I discovered executive coaching and leadership coaching and the International Coach Federation, and how powerful it can be to ask good questions, listen well, and be there for someone as they're trying to figure out, how can I make the greatest impact through my life?
Well, I have to say you are the first guest who is a graduate of RADA, Royal Academy of Dramatic Arts. Quite an illustrious role of alumni there. So this is extraordinary. Now, I have a philosophy, and I've written about this more than a few occasions, about leadership being an act. Do you agree with that? And if so, tell me why.
I agree totally wholeheartedly with that and that leadership is an act. And in fact, leadership is an activity, not a position, is the first of 5 principles that the Kansas Leadership Center leadership framework is built on. And our book is really built on the idea that when everyone thinks about leadership as an act, that's when we can make progress and reach big aspirations. So why do I believe that? I came to Kansas not thinking I would work for the Kansas Leadership Center, but I showed up at the first event hosted by the Kansas Leadership Center, and Marty Linsky from Cambridge Leadership Associates and the Harvard Kennedy School was talking about leadership as an activity. And at this point, I'd already been teaching leadership at the University of Chicago and elsewhere, but leadership as an activity and the activity of mobilizing other people to make progress on tough, complex, what Marty called adaptive challenges, that was an eye-opener, a connector. Everything else fell in place for me.
Well, that's great.
I believed it before I heard it, but once I heard it, I felt compelled to,
Well, I like that because you tripped on, or you dropped a word that I think is very critical to leadership, and that's the idea of mobilization, getting people to come together and then work toward a common purpose. Would you agree? So,
Absolutely. And we talk about putting the challenge at the center. So our leadership model in When Everyone Leads, we're trying to get you to go from person or position centric to challenge centric. And that's that common purpose. It's collective purpose. And how do we really mobilize each other? Because nobody exercises leadership all the time. We need everybody looking at the challenge or the purpose from different directions and moving in the same direction, albeit differently.
okay.
But yeah, it all comes back down to challenge and purpose.
I can see the energy even on this tiny screen that you're projecting. You're physically engaged. So I know that you have an acting background. So that's good. Now, the thing about your book, When Everyone Leads, which means it's open, but then how the toughest challenges get seen and solved. And in the book, you have something called the gap. What is the gap and how do we address it or overcome it?
Yeah, John, the gap is really where leadership starts. Leadership starts with dissatisfaction. Leadership as an activity it's outside the realm of our daily work or our daily life. It's uncomfortable. It's risky. Nobody would do it if they weren't dissatisfied. So the gap starts with the question. When you think about the future of your community, your company, the people you care about the most, when you think about the future, what concerns you the most? But we can't stop there. And too often we get stuck there. We also have to ask, when you think about the future of your community, your company, what are your aspirations? And it's the fuel and the energy of those aspirations that causes people to step up and say, yeah, I'll do that. Or I can imagine something. But there's a third question. What makes leadership hard in the gap between concerns and aspirations? And when everyone leads, we have lots of people looking from different perspectives at what are those barriers? What keeps us from achieving our aspiration or our collective purpose?
Right.
And so when we look at the gap, those possibilities for leadership arise.
As you were speaking and lead into our next question about becoming a leader or perceiving oneself as a leader, I love the dramatic arts and theater, and I also liked stories of actors. And I'm blanking out on the two names, but it was a famous director and a famous actor. And the actor came to the director and said, this role, I can't do it like that. That's just not me. That's not my style. And the director looked at him and said, excuse me, I thought you were an actor. and then that quickly turned that person's idea around. So same with leadership. So people, you've coached or developed 15,000 people coming through your center. And so I'm sure more than once people have come to you, Julie, very talented and well-intended people, and say, Julia, I don't think of myself as a leader. What is your response? So
my response is, well, start authorizing yourself to behave differently in relationship to your biggest challenges. Start asking more open-ended, curious questions. Start having conversations that look a little bit like that gap conversation. Start asking people what concerns them the most. So leadership starts with you, I would say, and it has to engage others. So think about what matters to you and go talk to other people about it.
Now, you have something in as part of this in your book, is something called the heat. Yeah. So what is it, and is it a good thing or a bad thing? And then how do we deal with it? So.
Heat is neutral, actually. Like, think about you're trying to pop popcorn and you have a pot. And if you just put the oil and the corn in the pot and don't turn on the heat, you get nothing. But if you turn up the heat and leave the kitchen, you get a smoky kitchen. So leadership.
So
is
you've seen me
about-
make popcorn before. So
Yeah, I mean, I've been there. And leadership is about trying to keep the heat of conversations about tough challenges, about competing values, about losses that we might have to sustain in order to move forward, trying to keep those at a temperature people can tolerate. So heat is neither good nor bad, but it's something that if you're going to exercise leadership, you have to be prepared to kind of have your hand on the dial of your stovetop or your thermostat.
you mentioned a word that I think it's all of us are attuned to it now, and as we deal with the pandemic, and we're hoping it's in our closing standards, and the sense of loss. You mentioned losses. How does the role of losses enter into leadership or leadership issues, Julia? So,
Yeah, in the book, we start with purpose and the gap, and then we move to what makes leadership hard. And one of the things that makes leadership hard is that if we're going to mobilize other people, there's almost always going to be loss. If we're going to achieve a future that we want, there's always going to be hard choices. And so the counterintuitive thing that we've found in working with those 15,000 people over the last 16 years is that once you start talking about loss, once you acknowledge loss, it actually energizes people to want to lean into the work, because so many of us are frustrated with knowing that often with change, even positive change, comes loss.
now, let's clarify that. So, when you, in the context that you're speaking in it, the loss is it autonomy? Is it power? Or what is it, Julia?
Yeah, often. I mean, sometimes it's really concrete. It can be, well, think about the early days of women's suffrage. Are we going, and you might think about Black women in that movement. Are we fighting more for Black emancipation or more for suffrage? Where do we, where do we put our energy? And the kinds of conversations that maybe didn't get had between white women suffragists and Black women suffragists, so that people got left behind, or so that kind of thing. And those kind of issues are alive. I mean, for a city, do you build a park, or do you put more money into helping the homeless issue in your city? Okay. So losses.
Well, I think then ideally it would be the buzzword or phrase might be trade-off. But ideally, if I say there's a loss, say I'm doing well in my career, and all of a sudden I'm told you're going to report to Julia from now on. We're going, wait a minute. So I'm going to feel a loss in that sense of maybe my autonomy. So how do you, the boss, deal with that? So.
Yeah, maybe your autonomy, also maybe your sense of security, because you don't know, you've never reported to me before. You don't know if I'm gonna like the way you do things or don't. So I think, and often it's loss of a sense of competence or a sense of confidence when we try to do new things. So yeah, as if we were in that situation, I'd be speaking to those straight up. You know, John, I know that this, and I'd be taking guesses. John, I know that you could be feeling a loss of autonomy. And I wouldn't rush to a description of how great our partnership's going to be. I would just say, John, you might be feeling a loss of autonomy.
and then what? You wait for me to respond? Is that
then you have the opportunity to say, "Oh, yeah, I do feel that," or "No, I'm that crossed my mind, but I'm dealing with it." And at least you know Or you might say, yeah, how are we going to deal with that? And even if I don't stay quiet forever, but the fact that I have shown a little bit of empathy, whether I got it exactly right or not, 9 times out of 10 is going to help us build a relationship.
As I can't help keep coming down to this, that this is the actor in you. You're letting the scene develop. You're not revealing it all at once. You're just saying, you may be feeling this. Don't close the loop. And by the way, everything's going to be hunky dory. You just throw it in my butt and let me react. I like that. Let the scene unfold.
Mm-hmm.
That's okay. Now we get to another challenge. So on a more positive sense, folks come to you and they say, Julia, I love the program. I'm ready to lead, but my boss won't let me. So what do we do? So,
well, if your boss absolutely won't let you, then if we dug into that, I might say, well, John, how can you use these ideas in your family? And, especially if you start thinking about extended family, what are your aspirations and how can I play this out? I might suggest that you practice, that you get yourself on a board and start practicing these ideas in a volunteer situation with a nonprofit. And I would suggest that you try the ideas, assess the risk, maybe even work with a peer coach or a professional coach, and think about, what can I do? And really, again, all we're suggesting in this book is that at the end of the book, we're suggesting that people ask a different kind of question, more curious, more open-ended. We're asking that people offer more and tougher interpretations. And you can protect yourself when you offer interpretations with this boss who doesn't want you to lead. You can say, I don't necessarily buy this interpretation, but I just want to put it out there for us to consider. So you can find ways to ask curious questions, make tougher interpretations, and act experimentally or try things to learn in ways that are low risk and maybe not threatening to this boss who's uncomfortable with the idea of everyone leading.
Right. Now, interesting. There's a topic that I've dealt with and leading up. And if we get to this idea, leading through your boss as that, what is your perspective on that, Julia? So,
well, I think partnering with authority is really important. And in the book, we talk about, like, in some challenges or problems are technical. They've been done before. It's in your job description. You might need to get some training, but we have organizational structures and job descriptions for a reason. So things keep running smoothly. There are other more complex, what we call adaptive challenges. And in those, your boss needs you if we're going to make progress. So it's really partnering and acknowledging that there are constraints that come with authority, that there's a lot of expectation on that person in the boss, seat.
Touch on this. How are you defining constraints? The scope of control, lack of resources, or authority? How does that manifest itself, Julia? Because it's a real topic.
I'm talking about constraints, and I'm glad you asked that. I'm talking about constraints in terms of expectations. The higher up you go if you're the mayor, the mayor has in some ways more eyes on him, more people expecting something out of the mayor than a city council member, perhaps, or a community volunteer. So the mayor has a little bit less room to maneuver in trying to move a challenge forward. Same thing with the boss, the CEO in a company. She has probably a board having expectations. She has customers with expectations, and she has everybody throughout the whole organizational chart who wants her to move one direction or another. So you can if you understand that, you can play a role in helping her move something forward.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you talked about that, because an essential element of leading up is understanding where your boss is coming from, what he or she can do or cannot do or wants to accomplish. And so I like your idea of the word constraint. So there's only so much one can do. Work within that framework. Is that how you're saying this, Julia?
Yeah. And John, I love what you also added there, is that the boss may have his or her own priorities. And the more you can link what you care about, the more you can get curious about that, what he or she cares about most, and support that, even as that might push something that you care about forward.
Now let's flip it aside a little bit. We still on our up and comer, but so how can the person, the boss or an executive, make it, quote, less risky for a rising manager or executive? How do we minimize the risk, or should we minimize the risk?
We definitely should, because we need them. We need up and comers as allies as we're trying to get something done. And first of all, if you want to make leadership less risky for others, you can talk about leadership as an activity, and you can develop skills. I mean, you can bring, when everyone leads, how tough challenges get seen and solved into your workplace, and host book discussions. You could take KLC's second book, Your Leadership Edge, which is full of ways for people to intervene, and get people some training around some of those things.
Great.
That's one. Number two, when people try things, so say you've gotten them some training in how to ask good open-ended questions, or how to make tough interpretations. If this young person asks a question and it bombs, or people take offense because it was worded the wrong way, you can say, hey, John, I see what you were trying to do. Can I try reframing that question? Or is what you're saying with your interpretation that? And just by doing that, I mean, if I'm the boss and you're the up and comer, you now have more credibility and authority because I've partnered with you publicly.
That's great. And I want to back up on something that, because you said it at the very beginning, and you talked a lot about acting. Acting for doing. Okay. But you said something very important at the beginning about seeing. So what are we seeing? Are we seeing problems? Are we seeing opportunities? Are we seeing gaps? How does that manifest itself, Julia? So
we are seeing moments to intervene, to move a challenge forward. So if I'm working on building or rebuilding the culture of my organization in the wake of a big upset, I might look for opportunities to say, hey, I'm having lunch downstairs in the lobby at noon. Anybody want to join me? I'm looking for a moment to give people a chance to build back relationship after something's happened. So that's just one teeny little example.
Right. But it's also, I've always thought that my perception is that management is the practice of looking down to make sure everything gets done. It's a discipline. And leadership is aspirational looking up. Is that a definition that resonates with you and your work, Julia?
I think what I would adjust is that leadership is the act of looking around. You're looking at your challenge, but in terms of being in an organization, you're looking around to see where are opportunities for me to intervene and where are there opportunities for me to partner with somebody, and where are there opportunities for me to coach or encourage somebody to intervene from wherever they sit or stand in the organization.
I want to clarify this because you use the word intervene and intervene skillfully, and that's good. Is there a time for a leader not to intervene?
Well, we rarely use the word leader. We talk about positions of authority and the exercise or practice of leadership, because if leadership is a practice, then anybody can do it. And anybody, no matter your position, can get better at it. And yes, there's absolutely a time, first of all, for the intervention that is diagnosis and trying to understand the system better. So there's lots of there are many times when I should be doing nothing but looking around and maybe making some interpretations in my head about what's going on in relationship to the challenge. Another thing is I need to be prepared. Nobody leads all the time. So I also want to be available to be mobilized, so that, if somebody who has a different view on the challenge says, hey, let's go talk to this group of people, I just need to be available to listen.
Well, that's great. And I like how you talk about the concept of leadership as almost a universal, and we all can do it. It's the willingness to buy into the process and commit to it. That's a leveling, that's a democratic way of looking at leadership, and a distributive way that empowers us and, enables us to have more control over a situation around us. Not so. Great. Well, Julia, we are racing along. This has been a very rich conversation. So, and I appreciate that. And so, as you know, I always ask every guest a story about grace. Do you have one that you'd like to share with us? So,
yes, I went to a party in 2000 and reconnected with a man who said, do you want to move to Kansas with me in 5 years? And I was just in that kind of mood where I said yes. And we did. And eventually I said, and I want to have a child. And we did. And eventually I learned that right as we moved, the Kansas Leadership Center was founded. And so this was back in 2006, 2007. And I feel like, that do you want to move to Kansas with me in 5 years was a calling to be a part of this mission to build cultures where everyone leads.
What a great story. I like that. And so that certainly is a transformative, sorry, the question itself was, do you want to move to Kansas, might be transactional, but really it transformed. What it led to was a transformation of your life, if I'm not mistaken.
It sure did. It sure did, in ways I could never have imagined.
That's great. Julia, thank you. The name of the book is When Everyone Leads, How the Toughest Challenges Get Seen and Solved.
May I hold it up?
Absolutely, you may. Shame on me for not saying.
This is the book.
Oh, I like it. That's a great title.
It's only 3 weeks out in the world, or maybe 5 now, but we're so proud of it.
Well, you should be very proud of it. And that yellow, hold that up again. So I want to see that. And that yellow just pops. So kudos to you. So anyway, Julia, how can people find the book and find you?
Well, they can find the book by me and Ed O'Malley any place where books are sold. You can also find links at kansasleadershipcenter.org. So that's where you can find me.
Great. Julia Fabris McBride, it has been an honor to speak to you today. Thank you for this provocative and enlightening conversation. And with that, we will go out.